The afternoon sun beat down on the coral ridge south of Bloody Nose, and Corporal Eugene Sledge's hands moved with a rhythm he no longer had to think about. 8 rounds into the M1 Garand. The distinctive ping as the en-bloc clip ejected. Another clip in, thumb clear of the bolt. Fire. The Japanese soldier, young, maybe 19, had been trying to reload his Type 38 Arisaka rifle for the 3rd time since Sledge had begun this particular engagement. The bolt action required deliberate movements. Lift the bolt handle, pull back, extract the spent cartridge, push forward, rotate down, acquire target, fire. In the time it took that soldier to cycle through those motions twice, Sledge had put 16 rounds downrange. The mathematics of it were brutal and inescapable. This wasn't about courage or training or fighting spirit. This was about mechanical advantage measured in seconds, and seconds measured in survival. The M1 Garand weighed 9.5 pounds unloaded. Japanese officers, steeped in the Bushido warrior tradition and the belief that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage, had initially dismissed it as too light to be accurate, too light to handle the recoil, too light to be a real infantry rifle. That assessment, filed in reports from intelligence officers observing American equipment before the war, would prove to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in Japanese military planning. Because what they interpreted as a weakness, that peculiar American obsession with making things lighter, faster, more efficient, was actually a revolution in infantry combat that would rewrite the rules of engagement across every Pacific battlefield from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. The story of how this supposed weakness became an overwhelming advantage begins not on a Pacific island, but in the mind of a Canadian-born engineer who understood something fundamental about human beings and warfare. Soldiers were not machines. They were biological systems with limits, and those limits determined everything. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. John Cantius Garand arrived at Springfield Armory in 1929 with an obsession. Born in Quebec in 1888, he'd spent his childhood around textile mills, places where efficiency wasn't philosophy but economic survival. Every wasted motion, every excess ounce of weight in a mechanism translated directly to lost productivity. He'd carried that mindset through his early work on bolt-action rifle designs, but the First World War had shown him something that most traditional military minds refused to see. The bolt-action rifle was an evolutionary dead end. The problem wasn't immediately obvious. Bolt-action rifles like the British Lee Enfield or the German Mauser 98 had dominated warfare for decades. They were reliable, accurate, and relatively simple to manufacture. But Garand had read the after-action reports from the Western Front. He'd studied the casualty statistics, and he'd noticed something that generals tended to overlook. Most infantry combat happened at ranges under 300 yards, in bursts of violence lasting seconds or minutes, not hours. In those moments, the side that could put more accurate fire down range faster won. Everything else, rifle weight, ballistic performance at 800 yards, bayonet mounting systems, was secondary to that fundamental truth. The United States military establishment didn't particularly want to hear this. Throughout the 1920s and early 30s, senior officers argued passionately for maintaining the bolt-action Springfield 1903. They cited accuracy. They cited reliability. They cited the proven track record. What they really cited was tradition, and the comfortable certainty that American soldiers, with their superior training and marksmanship, didn't need mechanical advantages. The rifle wasn't the limiting factor, they insisted. The soldier was. Garand disagreed, and he had mathematics on his side. A trained soldier with a bolt-action rifle could fire between 12 and 15 aimed shots per minute under ideal conditions. In combat, with stress and fatigue and the basic human instinct for self-preservation interfering, that rate dropped to perhaps 8 to 10 rounds per minute. The M1 Garand, gas-operated and semi-automatic, could theoretically fire 45 to 50 aimed shots per minute. Even accounting for the chaos of combat, even assuming the rate dropped by half, a soldier with an M1 could deliver 2 to 3 times the firepower of a bolt-action rifleman, and he could do it with a rifle that weighed less than most battle rifles of its era. The weight issue became central to Garand's design philosophy. Traditional military thinking held that a heavier rifle was inherently more stable, more accurate, and better able to handle powerful cartridges. The Springfield 1903 weighed 8.7 pounds empty. The British Lee-Enfield No. 4 weighed 9 pounds 2 ounces. The Japanese Type 38 Arisaka weighed 9 pounds 1 ounce. These were substantial weapons, designed for an era when soldiers were expected to fire carefully aimed single shots at distant targets. Garand looked at that paradigm and saw waste. Every extra ounce a soldier carried in his rifle was an ounce he couldn't carry in ammunition, water, medical supplies, or any of the 1,000 other things that kept him alive in sustained combat. More importantly, a lighter rifle was faster to shoulder, faster to swing between targets, and less fatiguing during extended engagements. The engineering challenge was formidable. Making a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle work reliably required solving problems that had defeated designers for decades. The rifle needed to extract enough gas from the fired cartridge to cycle the action without creating excessive wear or fouling. It needed to handle the violent forces of semi-automatic operation without shaking itself apart. It needed to maintain accuracy despite the additional moving parts. And it needed to do all of this while weighing less than contemporary bolt-action rifles and functioning in every climate from Arctic cold to tropical humidity. Garand's solution was elegant in its complexity. He routed gas from the barrel through a port near the muzzle, using it to drive a piston that cycled the action. The 8-round en-bloc clip fed directly into the receiver, eliminating the need for external box magazines. When the last round was fired, the clip ejected automatically with that distinctive metallic ping, signaling the shooter to reload without requiring him to manually check his ammunition state. The entire mechanism was precisely balanced to function with the standard 30-06 cartridge, while keeping the rifle's weight below 10 pounds. Springfield Armory approved the design in January 1936. The rifle entered production in 1937, but full-scale manufacturing didn't begin until 1940, just as the world was sliding into total war. The initial production runs went to training units and specific infantry divisions. Most American soldiers in 1941 were still carrying Springfield bolt-action rifles, the same basic weapon their fathers had carried in the First World War. The M1 was coming, but slowly, constrained by manufacturing capacity and military bureaucracy. On the other side of the Pacific, Japanese military intelligence officers were collecting information about American infantry weapons. They noted the M1's semi-automatic operation. They recorded its weight, its rate of fire, its effective range. And they filed reports suggesting it was an interesting but ultimately flawed design. The rifle was too light to be truly accurate. The semi-automatic mechanism would prove unreliable in field conditions. The en-bloc clip system was vulnerable to dirt and damage. American soldiers, they assessed, were trading battlefield effectiveness for mechanical novelty. It was the kind of shortcut wealthy, industrialized nations took when they valued comfort over combat capability. This assessment wasn't pure prejudice. It was rooted in a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare. Japanese military doctrine in the 1930s emphasized spiritual strength, discipline, and the warrior ethos. The Type 38 Arisaka rifle had been adopted in 1905 and remained the standard infantry weapon through the Second World War. It fired a relatively low-powered 6.5 millimeter round, which produced less recoil and allowed for faster bolt manipulation than heavier cartridges. Japanese soldiers trained extensively in marksmanship and were expected to make every shot count. The rifle was seen as an extension of the warrior's will, not a mechanical solution to combat problems. The Type 38 weighed 9 pounds 1 ounce and measured 50 inches in length. It was a beautifully manufactured weapon, precise and reliable, with a smooth bolt action that a trained soldier could operate quickly. Japanese military planners believed their emphasis on marksmanship training and fighting spirit would offset any mechanical advantages American weapons might possess. They had studied American industrial capacity and recognized its scale, but they fundamentally misunderstood what that industrial capacity would produce. They expected quantity. They prepared for waves of adequately equipped soldiers. They didn't anticipate that American industry would democratize technological advantage, putting superior equipment in the hands of every infantry rifleman. The Japanese assessment also reflected their own combat experiences in China and Manchuria, where their opponents typically carried inferior weapons and lacked industrial support. In those campaigns, Japanese rifle doctrine had proven effective. The Type 38's combination of accuracy, reliability, and ease of maintenance had served soldiers well across diverse terrain and climates. There seemed little reason to question a system that worked. The notion that American infantry might possess a decisive technological advantage in the basic infantry rifle, the most fundamental weapon of ground combat, seemed unlikely. After all, rifles were mature technology. How much better could one really be? The first large-scale combat test of this miscalculation came at Guadalcanal in August 1942. The 1st Marine Division that landed on those beaches was among the first American units fully equipped with M1 Garands. The Japanese forces defending the island were armed primarily with Type 38 Arisaka rifles. On paper, both sides had infantry rifles effective to approximately 500 yards, fired by trained soldiers familiar with their weapons. In practice, the engagement was profoundly asymmetric from the first contact. Private First Class Robert Leckie, a machine gunner with the 1st Marine Division, who later wrote extensively about his experiences, described the sound of an M1 Garand firefight as fundamentally different from anything in previous wars. It wasn't the discrete crack-pause crack of bolt-action rifles exchanging fire. It was a sustained ripple of fire, individual rifles producing rapid strings of shots that blended together into a continuous roar. Japanese soldiers trained to fire, work the bolt, acquire a new target, and fire again, found themselves facing an enemy who could fire 8 times before needing to reload, then reload in under 2 seconds and resume firing. The tactical implications became apparent immediately. In jungle warfare, where engagements typically happened at ranges under 100 yards and targets appeared suddenly before disappearing into vegetation, the ability to put multiple rounds downrange rapidly was decisive. A Marine could fire at a moving target, adjust, fire again, adjust, fire again, all within seconds. A Japanese soldier with a bolt-action rifle had to choose: fire at the glimpsed target and hope for a hit, or track the target and risk not getting a shot off at all. Every time he worked that bolt, he was vulnerable. Every time the Marine pulled the trigger, another round was on its way without any interruption in his sight picture or combat readiness. But Guadalcanal was jungle warfare, close-quarters chaos, where doctrine broke down and combat devolved into survival. Japanese officers could attribute American success to numerical superiority, artillery support, air power, anything but the infantry rifle. The mythology of the warrior spirit, of superior training and discipline overcoming material disadvantage, remained intact. The M1 Garand was just another piece of American equipment. Impressive, perhaps, but not decisive. The decisive factor, Japanese doctrine insisted, was the will to fight. And Japanese soldiers, properly motivated, possessed that will in abundance. That comfortable delusion would persist through 1943 and into 1944, sustained by the nature of jungle and island warfare where multiple factors determined outcomes. Then came the Central Pacific Campaign, and with it, a type of warfare that reduced combat to its essential elements: infantry, rifles, and the mathematical reality of aimed fire under pressure. Eugene Sledge enlisted in the Marine Corps in December 1942, driven by the same mixture of patriotism and youthful conviction that motivated thousands of young men that year. He completed boot camp at San Diego, then advanced training at Camp Elliott. Like every Marine recruit in 1943, he spent countless hours with the M1 Garand, learning its manual of arms until the movements became reflexive. 8-round clip goes in, thumb stays clear of the bolt. The distinctive ping when empty. Immediate action drills for malfunctions. Marksmanship fundamentals at 200 yards, then 300, then unknown distance. The Marine Corps approached the M1 Garand with an intensity that bordered on religious devotion. Rifle marksmanship had always been central to Marine culture, dating back to the Corps' founding. The arrival of the M1 didn't diminish that emphasis. It amplified it. A Marine with a bolt-action rifle was a rifleman. A Marine with an M1 Garand was a rifleman whose mechanical advantage allowed him to apply his training with devastating efficiency. The Corps built its entire infantry doctrine around this reality. Sledge absorbed this training with the earnestness of a young man who understood at some level that his life would depend on it. He learned that the M1's gas operation required the rifle to be kept clean and properly lubricated, but not overly so. Excess oil attracted dirt and could cause malfunctions. He learned that the en-bloc clip's ejection, that distinctive ping, could theoretically alert enemies that he was reloading. So tactical doctrine emphasized reloading behind cover and never allowing the rifle to run dry if alternatives existed. He learned that the M1 was capable of exceptional accuracy, easily capable of hitting man-sized targets at 400 yards, but that most combat happened much closer, where speed and volume of accurate fire mattered more than precision at distance. What Sledge couldn't learn in training was what it felt like to use these capabilities against another human being who was trying to kill him. That education would come later, on an island whose Palauan name was Peleliu, but which Marines would remember as some variation of hell. The 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu on September 15th, 1944. Intelligence had predicted the island would be secured in 4 days. The battle would last 2 months and become one of the most costly operations in the Pacific War. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had abandoned the traditional beach defense strategy in favor of a defense in depth, utilizing the island's coral ridges and natural caves to create a fortress that would have to be reduced by infantry assault. There would be no dramatic breakthrough, no clever flanking maneuver. Just Marines with rifles, fighting their way through prepared defensive positions, ridge by ridge, cave by cave. Sledge's company, K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, spent weeks in that coral nightmare. The physical environment was nightmarish enough. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees, water was scarce, and the coral itself seemed designed to inflict maximum misery, cutting through clothing and skin with equal ease. But the tactical reality was worse. Japanese positions were typically invisible until they opened fire. Soldiers would be concealed in caves or spider holes, allowing Marines to pass by before attacking from behind. Every advance was measured in yards, every yard paid for with casualties. It was in this environment that the M1 Garand's advantages became undeniable and measurable. Sledge kept his rifle with him constantly, sleeping with it, eating with it, moving through combat with it as an extension of his body. The 9.5-pound weight that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as insufficient became perfect, heavy enough to be stable during aimed fire, light enough to carry through weeks of continuous combat without becoming an unbearable burden. The semi-automatic operation that traditionalists had worried would encourage, wasting ammunition instead became a survival tool in a specific type of engagement. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. A typical engagement might develop like this. Movement through coral outcroppings, suddenly a muzzle flash from a concealed position 30 yards away. The Marine with the M1 would already be shouldering the rifle as he located the threat. First shot, breaking contact or suppressing the enemy position. Second shot, adjusting based on where the first round impacted. Third shot, refining aim. Fourth, fifth, sixth shots, maintaining pressure. The Japanese soldier firing his Type 38 would be working the bolt between each shot. Lift, pull, push, rotate, aim, fire. In the time it took him to fire twice, the Marine had delivered 6 rounds. If the engagement continued, the Marine would reload in under 2 seconds and resume firing. The Japanese soldier would be working his bolt, trying to acquire a target that was putting continuous, accurate fire on his position. This wasn't spray and pray. Marine training emphasized aimed fire, and the M1's semi-automatic operation actually enhanced accuracy by allowing the shooter to maintain his cheek weld and sight picture between shots. The rifle's gas operation absorbed recoil smoothly, the sights barely disturbing between rounds. A trained Marine could walk fire onto a target, adjusting after each shot, without losing his shooting position. The bolt-action rifleman had to break his sight picture with every shot, reacquire the target, and aim anew. The mathematical advantage that John Garand had engineered into his rifle design became brutally apparent in sustained firefights. Japanese soldiers were discovering that courage and training and tactical skill couldn't overcome the simple arithmetic of aimed shots per minute. A Marine company conducting a sweep through a ridge complex could deliver hundreds of rounds of accurate rifle fire in the time it took a similarly sized Japanese unit to deliver a fraction of that volume. The Americans weren't better shots necessarily. They had better tools, and those tools multiplied the effectiveness of their training by a factor that Japanese military planners had never seriously considered. Sledge would later estimate that in certain engagements he fired his M1 Garand 96 times, while Japanese riflemen in the same time frame managed perhaps 12 bolt-action shots. The ratio varied with circumstances, but the underlying reality was consistent. The Americans could shoot faster, reload faster, and maintain continuous pressure in ways that the Japanese couldn't match with bolt-action rifles. And this advantage held true whether the American was a highly trained marksman or an adequate rifleman. The M1 elevated everyone's combat effectiveness. The experience of carrying the M1 through extended combat revealed other advantages that hadn't been fully apparent during testing. The rifle's balance point, carefully engineered by Garand, made it handle quickly despite its length. Marines could swing it onto target faster than heavier rifles, crucial in close-quarters combat, where fractions of a second determine survival. The gas operation, while requiring proper maintenance, actually proved remarkably tolerant of field conditions. Coral dust that would have jammed some mechanisms passed through the M1 system. Tropical humidity that rusted other weapons could be managed with basic maintenance. The en-bloc clip system, which critics had worried would be vulnerable to damage, proved surprisingly robust. The clips themselves were stamped steel, simple and difficult to break. They fed reliably even when dented or corroded. The automatic ejection when empty, that distinctive ping, became a tactical consideration that Marines learned to manage. Some would deliberately fire 7 rounds and reload manually, keeping 1 round in the chamber and avoiding the sound that could alert nearby enemies. Others embraced it, recognizing that in the chaos of combat, enemies rarely heard or reacted to that specific sound. The important thing was that it told the shooter exactly when to reload without requiring him to count rounds or check the magazine. The Japanese military's response to this reality evolved slowly and incompletely. After-action reports from Peleliu and other Central Pacific battles noted American firepower superiority. Some reports specifically mentioned the M1 Garand's rapid rate of fire, but the institutional response remained rooted in the belief that spiritual strength and tactical innovation could compensate for mechanical disadvantage. Japanese soldiers were exhorted to fight harder, to embrace closer combat, where American firepower advantages would be reduced, to use infiltration tactics and night attacks to negate the M1's effectiveness. These adaptations had some success. Night fighting and close combat did reduce the M1's advantages. Japanese emphasis on camouflage and concealment forced American infantry to expose themselves to identify targets. Infiltration tactics created confusion and prevented Marines from bringing overwhelming firepower to bear. But these were tactical adjustments to mitigate a fundamental problem, not solutions that eliminated it. In daylight combat at visible ranges, which constituted the majority of infantry engagements, the M1 Garand gave American infantry a decisive edge. What Japanese intelligence had identified as weakness, the rifle's relatively light weight, its semi-automatic mechanism, its reliance on industrial precision manufacturing, were actually the precise characteristics that made it superior for the type of infantry combat that dominated the Pacific War. The lightweight allowed Marines to carry more ammunition, to fight for extended periods without fatigue compromising their effectiveness, to maintain mobility under combat loads. The semi-automatic operation allowed them to engage multiple targets rapidly, to maintain continuous fire on defensive positions, to react faster to threats. The precision manufacturing, backed by American industrial capacity, meant that every M1 performed consistently, that replacement parts were available, that damaged rifles could be repaired or replaced. The Type 38 Arisaka wasn't a bad rifle. In many ways, it was an excellent bolt-action design, well suited to the military requirements of 1905 when it had been adopted. Japanese soldiers trained extensively with it and used it effectively, but it was a 19th century weapon system fighting a 20th century war, and no amount of training or courage could overcome that obsolescence when confronted with an opponent who had successfully mechanized infantry firepower. By late 1944, American infantry units in the Pacific were fully equipped with M1 Garands. The rifle had proven itself in every climate and environment from the Aleutians to New Guinea. Manufacturing had scaled up to produce millions of units. The logistics system delivered ammunition, replacement parts, and new rifles forward with efficiency that Japanese forces struggling with their own supply lines could barely imagine. Every American infantryman carried the same decisive advantage, standardized and industrially produced, backed by a support system that ensured it would keep functioning. The difference in ammunition supply alone was staggering. An American infantryman typically carried 80 to 100 rounds of .30-06 ammunition in 10 en-bloc clips. Resupply was regular and reliable. A Japanese soldier might carry 60 rounds in stripper clips for his Arisaka, and resupply depended on increasingly tenuous logistics as Allied forces cut supply lines. The American could afford to fire more because he knew more ammunition was coming. The Japanese had to conserve every round because replacement was uncertain. This psychological difference reinforced the mechanical advantage. The Marine with the M1 could be more aggressive because his supply situation supported that aggression. The battles for Iwo Jima in February and March 1945, and Okinawa from April through June, reinforced these lessons with terrible clarity. Japanese defenders fought with fanatical determination, utilizing every tactical advantage the terrain offered. They inflicted heavy casualties on American forces, but they couldn't overcome the fundamental asymmetry in infantry firepower. Marines and soldiers with M1 Garands could deliver aimed fire at rates Japanese riflemen couldn't match. That advantage, multiplied across thousands of individual firefights, determined outcomes. Japanese soldiers captured on Okinawa were interviewed about their experiences fighting American infantry. Many mentioned the volume of rifle fire they faced. One sergeant, a veteran of campaigns from China through the Pacific, told interrogators that American riflemen seemed to fire continuously, that it was like facing machine gun fire from every direction. He'd been taught the Americans were soft, that they relied on machines because they lacked warrior spirit. He'd discovered instead that they had machines that made warrior spirit irrelevant. You couldn't be brave enough or skilled enough to overcome an enemy who could shoot 8 times before you could shoot twice. This wasn't the testimony of a defeated soldier making excuses. It was an honest assessment from someone who'd experienced the reality firsthand. The Japanese military had built its doctrine around qualities, discipline, courage, training, tactical skill, that were supposed to overcome material disadvantages. Those qualities remained real and significant. Japanese soldiers fought with extraordinary determination throughout the war. But determination couldn't make a bolt-action rifle fire faster. It couldn't make a 9-pound rifle weigh less after weeks of continuous combat. It couldn't transform a soldier into a mechanical equal of an enemy who'd industrialized infantry firepower. Other Japanese prisoners described specific tactical adjustments they'd attempted. Some units tried to close distance rapidly, rushing American positions to negate the firepower advantage. This sometimes worked but resulted in catastrophic casualties. Marines with M1s could put dozens of rounds into charging attackers before they closed to bayonet range. Some Japanese soldiers tried to time their movements between the distinctive ping of the M1's clip ejection, assuming Americans would be vulnerable during that brief reload. But Marine doctrine emphasized reloading behind cover, and the 2-second reload time left almost no window for exploitation. Some tried to concentrate fire on American positions, suppressing them with coordinated volleys. But coordinating bolt-action fire required discipline that often broke down in combat, while Marines with M1s could maintain individual suppressive fire without needing perfect coordination. The M1 Garand remained the standard American infantry rifle through the Korean War and into the early years of Vietnam. Over 5.4 million were manufactured between 1937 and 1957. General George Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, a piece of hyperbole that nonetheless captured the weapon's significance. It wasn't that the M1 was perfect. It had limitations, and later designs would address those. It was that the M1 represented a fundamental shift in military technology, the moment when infantry rifles stopped being precision instruments for single carefully aimed shots and became rapid-fire weapons that transformed what an individual soldier could accomplish in combat. Eugene Sledge survived Peleliu and Okinawa. He came home, attended college, became a professor, and eventually wrote one of the most harrowing memoirs of Pacific War combat. In his book, With the Old Breed, he describes his relationship with his M1 Garand with something approaching reverence. The rifle had kept him alive through experiences that seemed designed to kill him. He'd cleaned it obsessively, maintained it with religious care, and fired it thousands of times in combat. He knew its weight, its balance, its quirks. He knew the sound of that en-bloc clip ejecting. He knew what it felt like to fire aimed shots rapidly, while someone was trying to kill him, to reload and keep firing, to maintain continuous pressure on an enemy position because his rifle allowed him to do what soldiers in previous wars couldn't. Sledge wrote about specific moments when the M1's capabilities made the difference between life and death. A Japanese soldier emerging from a spider hole at close range, Sledge put 3 rounds into him before the man could raise his rifle. A sniper in a tree line, Sledge fired repeatedly at the position, not sure if he was hitting, but maintaining enough pressure that the sniper couldn't effectively return fire. A night infiltration where movement in the darkness demanded immediate response. The M1 allowed him to fire at sounds and shadows without the vulnerability of working a bolt action in pitch blackness. These weren't heroic moments. They were survival, made possible by a tool that gave him options that bolt-action riflemen didn't have. The irony would have been apparent to Japanese officers who survived the war to reflect on their service. They'd dismissed the M1 as too light, as an American preference for comfort over capability. They'd been wrong in precisely the way that proved most costly. The rifle was light enough to be carried through extended combat without exhausting the soldier. It was fast enough to give every American infantryman the firepower of multiple bolt-action riflemen. It was reliable enough to function in every environment where it was used. And it was manufactured in quantities that ensured every American soldier who needed one received one, backed by logistics that kept it supplied and maintained. The spiritual strength and warrior ethos that Japanese military culture emphasized were real qualities with real battlefield value, but they existed in material reality, constrained by physics and engineering. A soldier's will to fight couldn't make bullets fly faster or rifles cycle quicker. Training couldn't overcome mechanical disadvantage when the gap was measured in aimed shots per minute. The Americans hadn't won because they were better warriors. They'd won because they'd understood something fundamental about modern warfare. Mechanical advantage, consistently applied across an entire force, was decisive. John Garand died in 1974, having lived to see his rifle become legendary. He'd spent 45 years working for the United States government designing weapons, and he'd never received royalties for the M1. The government owned the patents. He received his salary, and the satisfaction of knowing his work had contributed to victory. Late in life, he gave interviews where he discussed his design philosophy. The goal, he explained, had always been making the soldier more effective. Not the army, not the division, not the squad. The individual, soldier. Give that soldier a tool that multiplied his capabilities, make it reliable enough to trust your life to, and manufacture it in quantities that ensured everyone had access to it. That was the formula. Everything else was details. The too light rifle that Japanese intelligence had dismissed became the weapon that defined American infantry effectiveness in the Second World War. The weight that traditionalists worried about became optimal. The semi-automatic mechanism that skeptics thought would prove unreliable functioned with remarkable consistency. The industrial precision that critics suggested was unnecessary turned out to be essential, and the mathematical advantage that Garand had designed into every aspect of the weapon. More aimed shots per minute, faster reloads, less fatigue over extended combat, proved decisive in thousands of individual engagements that collectively determined campaigns. The gap between what Japanese military planners expected American infantry to be capable of and what Marines like Eugene Sledge actually delivered in combat was measured in those extra shots per minute. 96 aimed rounds versus 12 bolt-action shots, 8 rounds in the magazine versus 5, 2-second reload versus 5-second bolt manipulation. Every one of those differentials was a conscious engineering choice, carefully designed to give the American infantryman an edge. And every one of those differentials was dismissed by an opponent who believed warrior spirit could overcome mechanical advantage. The lesson was brutal and unambiguous. Modern warfare was increasingly about industrial capacity, engineering excellence, and the ability to deliver technological advantage to individual soldiers at scale. The nation that could design better tools and manufacture them in decisive quantities would possess an advantage that courage and training couldn't overcome. This wasn't a new truth. It had been apparent since the Industrial Revolution began changing warfare in the 19th century. But the M1 Garand made it undeniable in the most fundamental military interaction. One soldier with a rifle, facing another soldier with a rifle, both trying to survive the encounter. In the decades following the war, veterans from both sides would occasionally meet at reunions or historical conferences. These encounters, awkward at first, sometimes led to frank discussions about combat experiences. Japanese veterans would ask about the M1 Garand, curious about the weapon that had given their opponents such an advantage. American veterans would demonstrate the manual of arms, the quick reloading, the ease of operation. What struck Japanese soldiers who examined the M1 after the war was how unremarkable it seemed as an object. It was just a rifle. Well made, certainly, but not exotic or intimidating. The revolution wasn't in the weapon's appearance, but in what it allowed a soldier to do. Some Japanese officers in their post-war writings acknowledged the miscalculation. They'd focused on intangible factors, morale, training, tactical doctrine, while underestimating the importance of industrial design applied to basic infantry weapons. The assumption had been that rifles were mature technology, that meaningful advantages would come from tactics and fighting spirit, not from incremental improvements in rate of fire or weapon weight. That assumption had been tested against Pacific combat and found catastrophically wrong. The Americans had brought an industrial revolution to the infantry rifle, and Japanese doctrine had no answer for it. In the years after the war, military historians would analyze the Pacific campaigns, identifying factors that determined outcomes. Air superiority, naval power, artillery, logistics, industrial capacity. All of these mattered enormously. But in the coral ridges of Peleliu, in the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, in the mud of Okinawa, the decisive interactions often came down to infantry with rifles. And in those interactions, the Marine with the M1 Garand possessed an advantage that was both subtle and overwhelming. He could shoot faster. He could shoot longer. He could maintain pressure. And he could do all of this while carrying a rifle that was actually lighter than his opponent's weapon. The influence of the M1 Garand extended beyond the Second World War. Every modern military rifle, the Soviet SKS and AK-47, the American M14 and M16, the German G3, the Belgian FAL, incorporated lessons from Garand's design. Semi-automatic or automatic operation became standard. Box magazines replaced en-bloc clips, but the principle of rapid fire remained. Weight considerations became paramount in rifle design. The idea that an infantry rifle should be light enough for extended carry while powerful enough for effective combat, that it should allow rapid engagement of multiple targets, that it should be reliable enough to stake your life on. These principles, pioneered by Garand, became foundational to all subsequent infantry weapon development. The too light rifle wasn't too light at all. It was exactly right. Right for the soldier who carried it, right for the type of combat it would face, right for the industrial system that produced it. Japanese intelligence had looked at the M1 Garand specifications and seen weakness. They should have looked more carefully at the engineering philosophy behind those specifications, because embedded in that 9.5-pound semi-automatic rifle was a way of thinking about warfare that would define the rest of the 20th century. Give your soldiers better tools, manufacture those tools at scale, and let mechanical advantage determine outcomes. Warrior spirit was admirable. Engineering excellence was decisive. The coral ridges of Peleliu are quiet now, reclaimed by vegetation and time. But the lesson learned there remains relevant to anyone studying military effectiveness or technological advantage. the side that dismisses incremental improvements in basic tools, the side that believes intangibles can overcome mechanical disadvantage, will face terrible surprises when theory meets reality. Eugene Sledge, carrying his M1 Garand through some of the most brutal combat in human history, learned this lesson at a cellular level. The rifle in his hands wasn't just a weapon. It was the physical embodiment of an industrial philosophy that recognized soldiers as humans with limits and designed tools to extend those limits as far as engineering would allow. That recognition, translated into 9.5 pounds of steel and wood, made all the difference. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.